see forum actually afterwards. I was just mentioning that before. So with that, over to Jim St. Clair from Lumedic, sorry, pronounce it correctly.
Yeah, you got it.
There you go. Great.
Thank you, kind sir. And I would just call out Kay. It's great to see you here. Colin Wallace and I used to talk on a regular basis, and quite a few of my colleagues and some of the consortia we'll talk about today are also involved with Kantara. I send the Kantara Health Identity Assurance Working Group with Barry and a few other folks. So welcome. It's good to see you.
Thank you. I thought I recognized your name actually, because I've been in on some of those work groups. So
yeah, Colin probably left that sheet behind, all these notes about, you know, who not to talk to, and I was probably close to the top of the list. So yeah.
No, not at all.
Absolutely.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it.
You bet, absolutely. And bear with me just a minute here while I sort out sharing on my Mac. I had to shift for my. There we go. That should work. If you can't see the screen. So a little bit of background. I have quite a few slides. Some of it's a bit technical. I've been the guy waving his hands around in the air talking about identity as it relates to consent. And we'll walk through some of the mechanics of that. Touch upon both conceptually what identity and consent is, especially in the context outside of the US and EU and GDPR and Canada and what they're working on, which I think, as we've seen with the environmental scan, some of the discussions we've had, as much of what we're doing, certainly in my opinion, relates to changes around policy, procedures, regulatory framework, even culture, as they do as much around technical and architectural considerations for what we call consent or how we enable consent. And I think some time back, I apologize for not making it sooner, there was an intent for me to kind of elaborate a bit and say, well, Jim, what the heck are you talking about with all this identity stuff, and how does it factor in, especially this concept of self-sovereign identity? And happy to walk through all of that for you today. Let's see if I can, there we go. So a couple of these slides are a little bit different, and I try and give credit because it represents an amalgamation of other colleagues of mine and other participants in this community. Self-sovereign identity, as it talks about here, is both an ideology and an architecture. And there are, you know, comparatively small groups, but still represents in absolute terms, thousands of people around the world in various time zones who are working on different aspects of this, either from some sort of group advocacy standpoint, policy standpoint, such as, you know, Tim Boma in Canada, or represent groups like the Hyperledger Foundation, Sovereign, ID Union, et cetera, that are all trying to enable these in consortia with architectures. So from an architecture standpoint, I'll also refer to decentralized identity. That is synonymous with self-sovereign identity, but we'll talk a bit through about, you know, what it means from a concept standpoint. So sovereign identity, quite frankly, is based on principles of enlightenment and the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There are, in fact, folks in this community that you would expect that are zealots about this sort of thing, who believe entirely in the concept of self-sovereignty. No one gets to see my stuff. That always doesn't pertain in healthcare, and we know why for practical purposes, but I did want to emphasize, you know, there are believers in this and who take the idea of universal declarations of human rights seriously, and the concept that I am my own person and that I am my own identity. So the basic premise is that you should control your identity in regards to your relationships and interactions with other people, organizations, and things. And as you'd expect, that, you know, that relationship to identity ties into how you manage your own privacy and the consent for sharing your information around those relationships and interactions. The principle of inherent dignity is that we all have inherent dignity independent of birthplace, lineage, or labels, simply because we are human. And that obviously carries over mechanically to principles of social determinants of health, gender identification, sexual orientation, et cetera, as principles in that dignity that people have an inherent right to protect and not necessarily be forced to share by either process or centralized authority. Now, from our perspective, from the self-sovereign identity perspective, you know, most identity platforms today are administered by centralized authorities, governments, corporations, software providers, et cetera. In other words, your identity as you interact with people, organizations, ecosystems is generally given to you. You create a password, you build a profile that is stored centrally someplace. You use those credentials to log in. All of us know from just looking at those icons what the underlying implications are for the data that you're giving to them as part of centralized organizations. And in one form or another, they have a vested interest in managing those people. And that vested interest may be with the best of intents, like a healthcare organization, or it could be, truly nefarious, like surveillance capitalism. But either way, you're still putting your trust or putting elements of your personal data and your identity into other organizations that you have to trust or hope somehow aligns to how you feel are being respected in the context of your rights or principles of rights that are important. So why do we have this move away from centralized authorities? We're more and more part of a global civil society. Our social and cultural affiliations and affinities may be aligned across borders and across nationalities or even theologies. We're part of more social networks and not just hierarchies. Borders and the natures of social contracts are changing, even in the midst of globalization and cross-border travel. Issues of tribal identity are important, ethnic identity are important. And then corporations and employers cross borders and as such cross sovereignties as well. As a result, all these parties are renegotiating the nature of their sovereignty and of their identity. So if authorities ignore the voice of ordinary people in these negotiations, that relates to the risks the individuals are greater, and thus self-sovereignty gives an individual a way to renegotiate what it means to be human in the digital world. That's that theology and the ideology principles. Now we'll start getting more into the mechanical aspects of the principles of self-sovereign identity created by a gentleman by the name of Phil Windley about 5-6 years ago. And I highlighted 3 of them because you can see 3 of them called out there: portability, interoperability, and consent go hand in hand with the sort of things we think about in terms of healthcare interoperability, portability of data, and of course, consent, which is, our raison d'etre for our discussions here. Also things like the nature and independence of their existence, control, access, transparency, which transparency comes up also in privacy by design, comes up again in things like GDPR, that the systems and algorithms that are managing your information should be transparent. Also, the principle of minimization is one that recurs across different regulatory frameworks as well, that you shouldn't be asking for more information than you need. And you shouldn't use the excuse that I just need to know more of it to do X as a reason to get around minimization. And then lastly, protection, of which protection is underwritten by the basis that, well, if you're minimizing the data you're collecting in the first place, it helps minimize the things that you have to worry about protecting.
Jim,
Go right ahead, Dan.
Jump in 1 second. Go back 1 slide if you don't mind.
Sure.
I just want to make sure I understand this. I really like the term self-sovereign identity, and I'm assuming, I just want to probe that and pause for a second, because ultimately when we think about consent utility, we're talking about giving people, I guess, sovereignty over their own data, what they're going to share. Is that consistent with what that terminology means? And or is there a nuance to it that is different than that?
That is spot on, and I actually feel reassured that you'd picked up on that, because I was kind of concerned about explaining it. But that is exactly right. So if you're thinking about sovereignty over your own identity, that in turn also means, by virtue of being sovereign, I proactively can enable consent for data sharing. And I'll call it Nancy for a second, because I've talked to Nancy before, familiar with Uma. Obviously, we talked a bit about Kentara, this concept of not only proactive consent, which is I choose in advance what I'm sharing, but also granular. We also get into topic areas, and Kentara has work groups on this, around conditional and even temporal aspects of consent. I'll share this with you for this period of time as part of this transaction or what we're doing. And then consistent with GDPR, you won't have that information anymore, or you'll dispose of it and provide me proof of disposing of it. If you get into the new ISO standards like 29184, that talks about consent receipts, which is I give you back a receipt that says, yes, I acknowledge I can have consent for the following things. or before I extend consent, you acknowledge that you're receiving consent for that and you'll live up to that. Those are all international standards and developments that are all based in some fashion on these concepts of self-sovereignty.
So I have a related question. Does one sign on to these principles? I mean, do organizations say this is how we, what governs or what guides our thinking? Or how does, maybe you get to this later, but I don't want to lose it. How do people, say, yeah, I believe in those 10 principles?
That's a fantastic question, Adam. And as I get more into the architecture, what the architecture and the open source software consortiums and stuff do is provide the technology to enable it. But you actually didn't ask an easy question. Lumedic is a commercial healthcare IT company. We're the first ones to offer this sort of platform based on this technology within healthcare. I wouldn't go so far as to say that you'd get the CEO to stand up and say, we're advocating for self-sovereign identity. But what we are doing is providing a platform that enables an architecture to do that. Now, the question is, who buys our software as an example? Obviously, individuals can't just buy software that plugs into Epic. So it has to be an organizational decision. So this is connected to Providence Health System's Epic system. Architecturally, it isn't fully deployed to recognize all of these capabilities. And as you'd see from an ideology standpoint, many of these ideas are vision or things to aspire to, but there are technical aspects of implementation and procedural considerations along the way. Does that help?
So I want to ask one clarifying question. I believe self-sovereignty goes a little bit further than when we typically talk consent, because usually consent is only needed for information that is considered outside of the user's role or organization. However, isn't self-sovereignty more about I own my data? So even if I'm working with, let's say, my primary care provider, that I own that history, he doesn't. And so whether or not he's got access to all of that data is up to me to determine.
Mary, that's a fantastic question, and you're exactly right. And part of why I wanted to present this was to stimulate understanding that there is a whole community out there, a global community, and that things like GDPR and others embody the framework and principles that are here that are very different, and that you articulated very well, that are a different mindset with how we do things. And you mentioned about patient owning their data. As you probably are familiar, 49 out of 50 states right now, with the exception of Live Free or Die in New Hampshire, say the owner of the EHR owns that patient's data. So what you get out of the Cures Act, the closest thing from a self-sovereign standpoint is the ability to exert control over that data, edit rights, share and stuff. But we're still not going so far as to say own that data. The ultimate vision for self-sovereign identity in groups like My Data Global and others is to say we have third-party personal data storage and encrypted data vaults, and things don't live in an EHR or live in a record. I get to control them and then share them out through consent-based mechanisms. That, obviously that presents tremendous, business and procedural, even ethical challenges if you're talking about a healthcare provider that needs what they need to know as part of rendering an encounter or a prescription, something like that. But I think we're starting to encounter that as a challenge anyways, because under the Cures Act, I can walk in and say, hey, that HIV test result, I don't want that there, take it out. Well, there's tremendous ramifications with what that means in terms of your continuity of care, how your provider feels about that. But the law says you can do it. And that in many ways is similar to the sorts of principles here that comes with responsibilities on the individual's part. And what that means for societal implications, socioeconomic responsibilities, which we have to work through. But I don't want the group to not be aware that this is a thing. And there are groups who feel this way on a worldwide basis.
Yeah, I was just listening to, I was at Chic earlier this week, and one of the HIEs was talking about this as a problem. How do you not track someone, because you have to at the very least know that they don't want to be tracked, which is requires that you track them.
Right, exactly.
Catch 22.
Decentralization in org.
I just threw this block in here real quick but I mean, the conversation has been wonderful and I greatly appreciate the comments. I think we're starting to appreciate, if you break down the key elements of GDPR, its relationship back to self-sovereign identity, even though GDPR kind of predates some of this SSI concepts, but they're all related and connected in terms of, data protection principles of what your identity is, how you use that to manage your privacy, and then the consent for sharing under those data protection principles. I also want to touch upon the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework because they're our neighbors to the north, and I know quite a few people involved there. Canada is not technically under GDPR, but they adopted a lot of the principles, even having Information Commission Office, which are like chief privacy officers for the province and for the country. And it is in the process of rolling out this Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, which is a framework that will implement these concepts of identity technologies in SSI within the public sector. So specifically, Ontario and others will start implementing digital identities using the principles of self-sovereignty as part of that. Well, I'll let her read it in. So. Now, as we get more into the technical discussion, here you'll see that I stopped using self-sovereign and refer to decentralized. Now we're getting into architectural consideration and what it means to go from those principles to the way software is going nowadays, and especially some of the standards organizations that I'm involved with. The traditional world, many of you are familiar, I'm sure, with centralized aspects of secure sockets layer, TLS, engaging with your web browser, being able to get to trusted websites, etc. We are now largely in the federated world, and lots of organizations representing federated identities, Karen Alliance, OpenID, etc. Federated takes the step away from the strictly server-based sort of centralized identity, but still relies on concepts of like identity service providers. In other words, I establish an identity with something or an organization, and that organization helps manage my credentials to be able to say, I am who I say I am. And that's different than ultimately still being able to say, I'm only going to present those aspects of my identity that I choose to, and that there are other cryptographic means, which we'll talk a bit about on the decentralized side, to cryptographically attest in a system, I'm Jim, I'm not going to tell you any more than I'm Jim, and here's my cryptographic trust as a holder of a verifiable credential that I am who I say I am. But you're not going to ask me 10 more questions or knowledge-based questions as to where I am and where I live, because I just choose not to disclose that information. So first of all, just to set the definition of what a credential is, because everything talking forward for this is around this idea of verifiable credential. It's a proof about something about ourselves. And all of us are used to these things. I didn't get a chance to go in here and paste a CDC card in the middle. I should have for physical credentials, something a government gives us, something an organization gives us that gives us attributes to what our identity is. The problem with today's credentials, and I know all of you are familiar with this, they don't always scale easily. They can't easily be verified online. They're easy to fake or forge. All of these have come up with the various discussions around vaccination credentials that I'm sure you've seen, and the concept of carrying around a paper card as a means to validate something. So verifiable credentials instead are a digital attestation of one identity owner about another. They're often called digital attestations or claims, though for the sake of standardization, we've settled on verifiable credentials. Much like your wallet with the different things that you own, verifiable credentials are something you keep in your digital wallet. DIDS refers to a decentralized identifier. I'll touch upon that. That's another standard that goes hand in hand with verifiable credentials. And you can manage then different aspects of your identity as you present them to engage in different things cryptographically and electronically based on what those verifiable credentials have. So you can see the example there that maybe one of which is my auto loan verification. So I am engaging with my bank around loan verification details. I present what I choose to present, except a digital credential that says I am who I say I am, only for an identity as necessary with data minimization just for that auto loan. That could be different than the characteristics I present in my master's degree in finance for educational purposes, for class attendance, et cetera. But it allows me to manage through those digital credentials what my identity is in every time, essentially eliminating that problem that I have to show my driver's license with all of my personal information just to get into the bar so I can buy a scotch. Verifiable credentials are all digital. They're under the owner's control. They're held in a digital wallet on your phone. For those of you, of course, with iPhones, it's very similar to the Apple Wallet concept. Very scalable, electronically speaking. They are also based, and we'll talk about this a bit more, on the JSON object format. Same thing as FHIR messages. Much harder to fake. They have cryptographic information, a whole bunch of stuff, which I won't go into on the cryptographic side. Something we call zero knowledge proofs, which is a cryptographic ability to prove I am who I say I am without having to go through a bunch of additional characteristics and queries and share more information. And the data by itself could be useless to thieves, because the concept is if I'm only sharing different aspects of what's cryptographically verifiable, someone just stealing it won't necessarily be able to do that. On the other hand, if I present my VCI QR code and someone takes a picture of it, I've lost control of that data once it goes out of my hands.
I want to understand that just a hair better.
Sure.
So if you lose your phone with all this data in it, a smart hacker or someone who understands verifiable credentials can't manipulate it to do anything of value?
That's a great question, Adam, and I would describe it this way. So speaking from a Lumedic solution standpoint, if you lose your phone, first of all, there's the aspect of whether somebody can unlock it. So, you know, the number
if
of
it's
phones
locked, if it's locked,
you know, and most of them default to lock, especially. So, and I'll use the iPhone as an example. You know, you can't pass Face ID. It's really difficult to hack the code. So let's assume that that takes place, and that's different than if you log into Find My iPhone, or you go to your phone company and they remotely wipe it for you, which is possible. Beyond that, if I lost my phone and get a new phone, you can use your Lumedic credentials to download your wallet, and in doing so, it'll give you a new set of download your wallet, and in downloading your wallet, pulls down all the credentials that you have there. So, you know, if they get into the phone and they can't biometrically authenticate to the device, that means they can't authenticate to the credentials that are stored in it anyways, making them worthless. Now, you know, as a former IT auditor, there's probably a whole school of thought out there, which quite frankly, we haven't gotten into, about hacking the phone and then hacking the credential. But it's still based on AES 256 and other forms of encryption that are still quite secure in different ways. And then also other things you may need to do when you present, or who you're presenting that verifiable credential to, may cause a challenge for being able to use it to steal it and use it in a nefarious way, if that helps. So there's 3 roles in the verifiable credential, what we call the verifiable credential trust triangle, and I have a couple graphics to show this. The issuer, the one that actually creates and issues the credentials, the holder, i.e. me, that is holding those credentials in the wallet, and then the verifier that has some technical means to verify the credential that I'm holding through a proof, like a QR code, a barcode, some other means for exchanging that from the holder to prove that I am the right holder and I am who I say I am.
I have a quick question.
Go ahead, Matt.
Sure. So if you have a situation where in order to get this issued, like in order to I've got to answer a few questions about myself, or I've to get that as a first step, right? Could there be essentially multiple issuers? So I go to one issuer to prove who I say I am, but then there's another issuer that's a health information exchange or something, or is it they're only going to be one issuer and one person in each of these places? Is that?
I'm just trying to fast forward through a couple of slides for time, and also to get to your question. So for
yeah,
instance, here's the example of the IATA travel pass, and I hope this helps answer it. IATA, the International Air Travel Agency, is working with some of the same companies that we are. It's built on the same technology. The idea being that you are the holder. You have gone to a testing lab. Testing lab says you're COVID-19 free. You get a credential back from that lab. You then provide that to IATA. IATA issues you a travel pass that says, good to go, you meet the criteria. You get to the airline, you present that verifiable credential from IATA, and they electronically verify and say, yes, it meets the rules, and you're all set to go. And that could consist, depending on what's required, of one or more credentials. You may have a vaccination credential, you could have a test credential, maybe there's a third credential associated with your identity, as in you're not traveling from a certain place. Your
Got it.
wallet can have more than one credential in it. And then depending on the scenario, that could be combined together to another credential, or those credentials could each be verified separately.
got it.
And just to kind of give you a look at what we're talking about from here, the holder, of course, is the individual with their wallet. We just walked through the issuer. The verifier is the airline. There is, for those familiar with PKI, there's a public key in the form of a decentralized identifier that is put onto a ledger, so that when the verifier is checking it, they can say, oh, this is a valid issuer because this credential has both the traveler's valid information on it, as well as a valid issuer saying that it's recent. So that obviously helps ensure that the network of issuers is kept up to date, so that you don't find yourself with a fraudulent issuer or an issuer that doesn't meet the rules for testing or something along those lines. But what we emphasize, and I skipped over this slide a bit, from a privacy standpoint, there's lots to talk about. Can't use blockchain for privacy. The blockchain and the ledger in this particular case is only for the public key. So it's only for something that's being shared publicly. All of the individual's information is stored within the credential based on how that credential is put together and controlled by the holder with what they share. And there we go. Quick plug. So this is the way we set it up in our wallet, just to give you a snapshot. There could be a COVID viral test, there could be some other self-assessment. Our vision is, and as we're trying to build upon this and integrate with other mechanisms, to have other credentials that may be associated with a provider-specific visit or other immunization information records, etc. And then, as you can see there, the idea that you can connect with an institution and share that information, or initiate sharing your credential. A use case that we're just kind of starting to dive back into, which we set aside for a moment after COVID, was patient registration. And Providence Health had an estimate of something like $12 million a year that could be attributed to the amount of effort to constantly verify and re-verify identity, and checking people in, and what is their eligibility status and their registration. And we offered this right off the bat, not only from the standpoint of how the patient can control that information, but let's just get all the parties to agree upon a digital standard or sharing a verifiable credential, that if they have that verifiable credential, they present it, then it validates it without a bunch of the additional effort that they've gone into, and saves the organization money. So there's both the self-sovereign privacy consent aspect to it, but there's also an ability to get organizations to trust one another how to share a credential as a means of improving and streamlining verification processes. I mentioned a bit about privacy by design. I can send you a link for the research paper that's done by the former Canadian Privacy Commissioner, Anne Cavoukian, who came up with privacy by design. You'll notice I mentioned some of these things before, the idea that it's proactive and preventative, it's not remedial. Privacy is the default setting, i.e. my privacy is always enforced first. Privacy is embedded into the design, meaning that when you're thinking through the system organization, how does privacy get represented? You should have full functionality of privacy across the entire spectrum. End-to-end security is obviously important. Once again, visibility and transparency. Everybody understands how the system operates, and then respect for the user privacy. In other words, making it user-centric. And I had a PowerPoint. I guess that's the end of my PowerPoint slide. Okay. Yeah, and good. I left some time behind. I was moving a little bit quick there. Any questions? Happy to elaborate. Anything that anyone didn't understand or anything that wanted to discuss further, or move them into other areas.